I think. Welcome to the new people. It's lovely to have you. So my name's Michaela Shan. I work at Hassel, for those of you who don't know. I'm a senior researcher there, and I'm stepping in as host today for Jacqueline, give her a rest for a while, share the love. And so today I'd like to introduce Anwyn Hocking. Anwyn recently completed a Master of Philosophy of Architecture and Urban Studies at the University of Cambridge as an Ackman Trust Scholar and recipient of the 2020 Dalibor Vesely Prize. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Anwyn. Great. Her research intersects psychology, sociology, and architecture to explore the experience of identity and community in different typologies of collective living. Before moving into research, Anwyn studied architecture at the Uni of Melbourne and worked with DCM, Dreamer Lab and Decibel Architecture. Based between Melbourne and London, she's currently working with Parlour as a research assistant and collaborating with the Loneliness Lab to investigate loneliness in student accommodation. Anwyn's going to share her dissertation research on the commercial co-living model for solo dwellers, as well as the benefits of qualitative research for practice. While co-living is yet to emerge in Melbourne, the sector's popularity and growth in the UK presents an interesting case in considering the predicted increase of single-person households across Australia. Anwyn's presentation is entitled Co-Living, a UK case study of collective living for solo dwellers. Jacqueline's going to record this session, just so that you all know, and then she'll be uploading it to the YouTube channel of this research group. So the link to that channel is included there in the chat. So I hope you enjoy Anwyn's presentation. Have a think about any questions you might like to ask her while she's presenting, and then we'll throw it open to the floor after she's finished. Over to you, Anwyn.
Thank you for that introduction, Michaela, and thank you so much to Jacqueline for the opportunity to present to everyone. I'm just going to share my screen. Can we all see it? Yeah, great. So yeah, as Michaela said, I'm going to share my research on co-living, first giving an overview of the model and then discussing my research on resident experiences. And after, we'll have some time for questions. In contrast to the really interesting presentations we've had over the past few months with practical considerations about undertaking research, as well as the overview of Arup's research, my presentation, as much as it is about co-living, it's also sort of an example of the type of specific in-depth qualitative research that can be applied to practice. And I'm hoping to sort of illustrate the value of qualitative research. So I'm going to try to get through sort of a lot of information, so bear with me. If I'm talking too quickly, as I sometimes tend to do, just sort of wave at me or let me know. So co-living is a globally emerging build-to-rent model for primarily solo dwellers, where there is a focus on creating a sense of belonging and connection through shared amenity space and resident community engagement programs. The small private rooms and communal spaces tend to be fully furnished. A single payment covers all bills and access to gyms and other amenities in the building, and they generally aren't sort of lock-in contracts, so residents have a lot of flexibility, and the model tends to attract and market toward the millennial demographic. Despite the impact of the pandemic, the long-term predicted growth of the co-living market remains. The trend toward solo living has been steadily rising across the global north. In Britain, 12% of the population live alone, and in Australia, 24%, so 1 in 4, which is projected to increase to 27% by 2040. The Australian build-to-rent sector, which includes co-living, is predicted to mirror the UK market. So in the next 5 years, similar to the sector's growth in the UK between 2011 and 2020, 8,000 sort of in the UK, 8,000 build-to-rent units will be completed in Australia between now and 2025. So it's sort of something really important that we need to think about going forward. In terms of the model's demographic, the majority of residents are within the 20 to 35 age bracket, with just 7% over 35. The model is slightly more popular with men, with over 59% male identifying residents and 41% female identifying residents. Residents are generally international. The largest portion are employees and then freelance workers. 77% are single, and for those who aren't, some co-living buildings do offer couple rooms, but the vast majority of units are for single occupancy. So my research stemmed from the well-publicised idea that co-living might be the answer to urban loneliness, which has become sort of a highly politicised topic. In London, loneliness is even considered to be an epidemic, and the British government introduced their first Minister for Loneliness in 2018. This idea that co-living might be a cure to loneliness is predicated on the assumptions that being alone means being lonely, and that simply increasing the frequency of social encounters will solve loneliness. Following this logic, much of the research on the architecture of collective living focuses quantitatively on analysing design features that encourage increased frequency of social interaction. So for instance, Joe Williams's 2005 UK study looked at a number of co-housing communities and suggested that restricting the types of activities carried out in private space could increase the frequency of social interactions. And while this may be true, the idea of decreasing private space to increase social interactions can overlook nuances of sort of human preference and habits towards social connection. So as an introvert, I can tell you that maximized social interaction isn't good for everyone always. So I was somewhat concerned with this, particularly given no research had actually been done on the residential experience of the community within co-living buildings. So through a qualitative approach with semi-structured interviews and a series of visual drawing exercises with a sample group of residents, I looked into exactly this at the collective Old Oak. The collective is Britain's largest co-living developer and operator, and this building was the first purpose-built co-living building in London, built in 2016. Because it was the first of its kind, this particular building is often sort of touted as an exemplar of good practice within the industry. So the 10-storey building accommodates 546 people, and the population is sort of reflective of the industry at large. The majority are within the 25 to 35 age bracket, single, and there are slightly more men than female residents. An array of collective spaces are included across the building. This is the ground floor. It has a gym, co-working space, restaurant. There's even a grocery store. And there are three sort of main room types. So the ensuite room, which is the most numerous, they have private bathrooms with then these shared kitchenettes. The studio rooms have a private bathroom and a private kitchenette, and then the DDA access rooms have these shared bathrooms and then private little kitchenettes. So I wanted to understand what motivates people to move in, what do they experience in this environment, and what is the nature of the community that forms within this. My participants were aged between 20 and 50, and their length of tenancy ranged between 2 months and 3.5 years. Their reasons for moving in were really varied. One of the main appeals of the building is the convenience. With the flexible rental contracts, the relative affordability and location, as it's on a number of public transport lines. The quality of the new building was also a really sort of large contributing factor, with many participants lamenting this low quality of housing on London's private rental market. For the most part, however, the aspect of community was a secondary motivation, as captured by one of my participants' comments, that the collective is really convenient, but actually the social side was a nice bonus. So I asked my participants to draw their daily routine, and a number of the drawings took this radial layering of experiences, as the building kind of becomes this microcosm where particularly remote workers, as we all are at the moment, have little reason to leave the building with all the amenities sort of supplied within. To reflect this, my analysis of the experience took an inside-out approach, the private to the communal or the individual to the community, starting with the private room. So 2 clear themes emerged around the private room. The first was the perception of the room as a base for sleep and storage. This was particularly linked with my sort of self-identified extrovert participants. One said that the room was like a cruise liner bedroom. It's his main base, but the aim is to be out. The second perspective of the room was as a kind of sanctuary associated with the more introverted participants. So regardless of how people viewed their private space, the problem of storage was a common theme. People spoke of the added cost of needing a separate storage unit outside the building, as the collective doesn't provide any additional storage facilities on site. Amusingly, one of my participants described that she came with 2 big suitcases, but there wasn't even space to store the suitcases. Another key theme was the sense of limited agency in this spatial arrangement, which prompts people to do most activities in communal space. For some participants who preferred to do yoga and other exercise alone in their room, the size essentially made this activity, which they did for their well-being, impossible. Following this, a number of participants spoke of the necessity for solitary space and time for creative work and the spatial requirements of this. For instance, one of my participants was a photographer, another one did a lot of silversmithing and sewing, and while living at the collective, they felt restricted in their ability to work on these projects. It's sort of very much aligned with Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own and the necessity of private space for creative pursuits. So in minimizing the private realm, these nuanced pursuits and habits are confined and, I suppose, in many ways controlled. So moving to the threshold between private and communal, for most people, they wanted their private space to be just that, private. The imposition of others in the form of sound or smell from cooking and smoking was something that was seen as particularly annoying. And the intimately shared space of the kitchen in the ensuite rooms just doesn't really work. So in this 4.8 by 1.4 meter space, the misbehavior of others is quickly perceived, with lots of sort of interpersonal tensions caused in people leaving utensils and other dirty dishes around, the hassle of not having enough space to cook at the same time. It kind of seems this like general knowledge amongst participants that you couldn't form a close friendship with your roommate because of sort of how problematic this form of intimate sharing is between essentially strangers. So in terms of the nature of community within the building, I analysed it against 3 essential characteristics of community. These components are the common threads linking sort of the plethora of sociological, philosophical, and urban definitions that exist as to what community actually is, because, well, what is it? So the first is identification with place. The second, common ties to perhaps purpose or experience. And the third, regular social interaction. So at the collective, as a place, the building, sort of the identification with place is very easily identified. Common ties, however, are less easily identified. One of kind of the differences with this type of collective living compared to other types, such as sort of co-housing that you might see with the Nightingale model, is that it's not intentional. So intentional communities are planned residential communities where from the very beginning of the project, there's a high degree of social cohesion, teamwork, and mutual understanding. Whereas with unintentional communities, these commercial forms of collective living, there's no need for interaction with others beyond purely social networking purposes. There's no sort of common value or goal or even activity. So in terms of the third element, regular social interaction, the collective certainly provides this kind of very people-rich environment. But while a lot of research in psychology has confirmed that mere proximity is an important factor in relationship formation, creating close, enduring emotional relationships, which is completely necessary for a sense of belonging and togetherness, takes time through the gradual accumulation of intimacy and shared experience. For those sort of few people who had 1 or 2 close friends, they did feel a sense of kind of belonging within the environment. But as the average tenancy within the building is 6 months, which is common across the sector, people are constantly moving in and out of the building. So rather than common bonds and shared experiences, what characterizes a lot of these relationships is kind of transience and a degree of superficiality. Sort of in spite of this though, people still find value in the relationships they're able to form with staff members. Lots of people spoke to me about how nice it is to come home every night and have reception staff greet them. As Liam said, in a lonely world, it makes you feel more welcome. So in considering these three elements of community, the COVID lockdown really confirmed a lot of these findings for me. So part of my research had to be conducted through the lockdown. And during this time, half my participants moved out of the building, which allowed for sort of fruitful comparison between the fully and minimally occupied building. So with lockdown, a fifth of the residents remained in the building, so only about 100 to 150 people. With fewer people, no new residents, and the restrictions of lockdown, people were able to get to know and form closer connections with others. For those who stayed, they described the community reducing to a more manageable level. In many ways, sort of the adverse conditions created by COVID created a common experience and atmosphere of concern for others. One of my participants, in apologising for not replying to some of my emails, said that he had been completely distracted by COVID because he was just having too much fun. Indeed, quantitative literature on collective living affirms a lot of this. A 1973 study looking at student accommodation described crowding-related stress. So this is in higher density buildings, residents are required to interact with too many others, that interactions too often occur at inconvenient times or with disliked others, and that a socially overloaded environment leads residents to experience stress. And other kind of studies in a similar area have found clear preferences for a few close friendships over a large number of good but less intimate relationships. So the maximized density, lack of common purpose, and limited tenancy periods in many ways impedes the development of an integrated, sort of socially meaningful residential community. Just quickly, some other interesting things that came out of the study were the everyday experiences of individuals of different genders and ages. For many young women, the safety of on-site staff, particularly reception staff, and having security measures such as sort of CCTV and security access made the co-living model particularly attractive. However, while this was attractive, within the interior of the building, there were discrepancies in feelings of safety between men and women. Many younger women described to me that older men would hit on them, which made them avoid a number of communal spaces and withdraw from events and activities. I could definitely say a lot more on this, but it's something sort of really important that is rarely discussed in the industry. So in terms of the perception of co-living between younger and older residents, the 20 to 35-year-olds really view co-living as a purely transient model. Whereas for the older 35 to 50-year-old participants, particularly the older men, co-living was viewed and used as a longer-term housing option. Many had been there for several years at the time of my study, and they had no intention of moving out in the foreseeable future. A number of them likened the experience to their university college days, which was something they really missed. The fact that older men seem sort of more attracted to co-living as a more permanent model possibly reflects sort of broader trends. For instance, in the UK, men in the 25 to 64 age demographic are more likely to be living alone than women. And there's a lot of sociology and psychology literature that suggests men experience loneliness more intensely than women, particularly when living alone. So for these older men, co-living provides a socially and emotionally acceptable vehicle to maintain their solo lifestyle. And I thought sort of this was nicely captured in the question one of my older male participants asked me: why would I want to go home every night and shut the door and have no one there? So to wrap up, the key takeaways to think about with projects going forward, given that solo living and the co-living industry are predicted to grow, particularly in Australia, a greater diversity of people motivated by both economic and social factors are likely to see co-living as a viable option in the future. And there's already evidence of this at the collective with the group of older male residents. The convenience, affordability, and social aspects of co-living can offer a practical and emotional support for solo living. Yet it really needs to be recognised that the lack of common purpose, short tenancy periods, and maximized residential density creates barriers to an integrated feeling of community amongst residents. And perhaps sort of from a client investor perspective, it can be noted that high tenant turnover and long vacancy periods are really detrimental to income. So those things kind of go hand in hand. The extreme limiting of private space also really needs to be rethought, as it can lead to a lot of stress and feeling unable to do various activities. And a lot of those activities that people want to do alone, they describe as needing them for their well-being. So ample private space is an essential companion to shared living environments. And I suppose somewhat revealingly, my photographer participant, after moving out of the building and into a sort of larger share house, had more space, and she started working on her photography projects again. So by taking the stories that I've presented of the lived residential experience into consideration in the design and operation of co-living buildings, I think the model has the opportunity to be an inclusive, potentially longer term housing option that's convenient and socially meaningful. Thank you, and I think we've got time for questions.
Fantastic, Anwyn. Thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating, and I can certainly attest to some of it because I did live in residential college for my university days. Mm-hmm. So some of the reflections of that certainly ring true to me. I'd be interested to hear, just to get the ball rolling, how you think there might be differences between the Australian and the UK context, and if you've kind of looked at that in any way.
So yeah, that's really interesting. I've kind of been thinking about this a lot, particularly, so I mentioned that lots of people talk to me about how it reminded them of living in student accommodation. And they miss that, and sort of all these kind of stories and rememberings of past accommodation experiences. And in Australia, we don't really have that. You know, when we go to university, some of us go and live in student accommodation, but from sort of a local perspective, I know lots of international students are now sort of moving into purpose-built student accommodation, and that's a huge area of like the Australian real estate market. But it's kind of interesting to think about how those memories shape whether co-living will be able to be an option for older people in the future. And I guess that sort of ties into the whole intergenerational housing question, sort of co-housing in general. And I suppose I spoke about it kind of briefly at the start, but it is predicted to sort of take off in Australia. I know Mirvac has a number of sort of build to rent buildings in construction or completed at the moment in Melbourne. Co-living is quite large in Sydney. There's a number of operators currently running buildings there. So yeah, it's kind of like it's coming, but I do kind of wonder what the model will look like in the Australian context. I don't know if that answered your question all that well.
It's not necessarily a question that can be answered until it happens, I guess.
Yeah.
But it is something worth considering. Does anybody have any questions for Anwyn? Hi, Rebecca.
Hello. Yeah, my question is just, I noticed that you were still referencing an environmental psychology reference from the 70s, which is one I still reference. But my question is just, is that because no one else has done any more research? And I guess the reason I'm interested is presumably generationally we've changed values, we've changed the way we interact with people. The fact that we're still relying on such old research seems really interesting.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So that Borman-Ballin study, which is from the 1970s, that is one of the sort of only studies that's been done on sort of social cohesion in student accommodation, which is exactly the same typology as what I was looking at. And yeah, it's really interesting because that sort of comes from a whole lineage of thinking sort of environmental determinism, and the built environment does shape your thoughts and sort of behavior. And maybe that's why research hasn't really taken off that much in that area, because like before I went to Cambridge, I was hoping to pretty much find out the answer to like how to make friends in like this kind of typology. And the more reading I did and the more research I did, I just sort of realized, well, that was extremely naive, and that's not how it works. Everyone is different. Everyone has different sort of aspects of their identity that interact with particular people, particular aspects of the design differently. So maybe that's why it hasn't. Maybe if you have some thoughts on
Well,
that.
I guess follow-up question then. Did you, and I know that their piece of research is pretty light on the details that they give in that article, but did you find anything that was suggesting any significant differences between what they found and what you were seeing?
Well, no, not really. Because I suppose, yeah, my main thing was this idea of the crowding related sort of stress, which was definitely something I noticed. I suppose they went into a lot more detail from like a deterministic perspective. You know, they found results, for instance, people living in corner units close to stairs were more likely to have more friends because they'd interact with people going up and down the stairs. So yeah, mine was kind of more holistic. I was looking less at specific design features. But yeah, like those kind of big perspective ideas were similar to what I found.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, hello, I'm Anne. Thank you, Anwyn. That was very interesting. There are two questions. One is actually about the business model of co-housing, as stated by Collective. It is also interesting too, is the idea of social psychologies. It's probably more practiced in the UK than in Australia. Often the developer's model for co-living is about profit. It's about holding a building in order to be able to rent out and maximizing the income from the household. That's in a very commercial sense. And what is also interesting too is we do a lot of student housing, student accommodations, and certainly the idea of pastoral care, the psychological health of the occupants, varies between whether it is university based or private development based or institutional development based. So perhaps part of that may be it's a result of the commercial model of various companies who are building this. But what is also interesting too is when you, Collective has a number of developments in the UK, do they actually collect data about the well-being of their residences? And how do they interact with you? Were they open to share those data with you?
Yeah. So yeah, the Collective does collect a lot of data on their residents, and they sort of try to take that forward with their newer developments. So last year they opened the Collective Canary Wharf, which is a 709 unit development. It's massive, but it's more sort of short term than longer term. People can stay there for a night, so it's pretty much a hotel that people can live in for longer. Kind of the interesting thing is I was talking to someone who works at the Collective at the moment, and even though they collect all this data and it's mainly quantitative data, because of their sort of profit margins and the commercial model, they're often not able to really apply it. And sort of this comes into, like, I suppose, my thinking around why qualitative data is so important. Sort of understanding people's lived experience and how the built environment influences their stories, their relationships. It's maybe like a good example is that sort of you can send out as many surveys and sort of tick box forms as you like, but if you don't know what you should be asking, you'll never know the truth. Maybe I'm getting a bit philosophical about it. But for instance, the gender equity aspect, which sort of I looked into quite a bit, didn't talk about all that much, but no one had ever thought to ask that question. And even I hadn't, like, it wasn't in my semi-structured interview list at all, but it sort of came out and it ended up sort of informing a large part of my research. So there's sort of important aspects that come out of that kind of data collection, and sort of I'm currently in conversation with the collective trying to sort of get this to them. But yeah, you're right. The kind of commercial model of it dictates a lot of what they're able to do.
I wondered too, just on that then, Anwyn, if there might be some parallels between the co-working boom and where it's pulling back to. So it started off as, you know, very small spaces, very high turnover, you know, very little allocated space, and has since kind of pulled back to a much more standard offering, in that people can now rent their own office, which might hold 2 or 3 people instead of just one, you know, desk that you might have on a, you know, once a week or whatever. I wonder if there's parallels here where, you know, they've been really brave and tried to minimise personal space and maximise collective space, but will pull back to essentially what is, you know, a flat for people and less collective space, but provide some sort of support services, just as co-working spaces do now.
Yeah, that's sort of a good point, and maybe some of my research is a little bit depressing in that sense, that it's like, oh, we actually still need private space. We can't.
Nothing depressing about that.
yeah, I know, but I guess in terms of how we kind of perceive, and there's like this assumed good of collectiveness, but I like, it's still interesting because like there were a lot of communal spaces that people really kind of loved in the building. Like, for instance, the laundry, like there were lots of sofas and stuff, and people loved just like hanging out and chatting to people while, you know, it was going through their wash cycle. But then, yeah, like again, like the co-working space in the collective, that sort of, yeah, it's hard for people with different sort of habits and even jobs, because yeah, people need a variety of sort of options of how they're going to work, and some people really enjoy working in co-working. So like, I'm not saying that those things are entirely bad, I'm just saying there needs to be like more options for different intersections of sort of identity.
Yeah, and so with student housing, for instance, you have a much smaller variation because you have people of a similar age and they have a similar purpose. They're there to study. Once you open it up to anyone with any job or without, from anywhere really, the cross section of people that need to be pulling all together in the same direction is, you know, that's a challenge. Yeah,
I agree.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just one. I did just send you a wee note on the side, but I was just thinking in terms of variations of floor plan and how those public spaces are related to the private rooms. I was just thinking, we went to a hall of residence where you had to go through the lounge room to get to your bedroom, and anecdotally the older students thought that meant you had a better sense of community because you were seeing the same 18 people all the time. So I'm just wondering if you looked at different typologies of co-housing, or if you're going to do that in the future.
Yeah, so this study was very much focused on this sort of double-loaded corridor typology with the small single rooms. I do hope to do more research on it in the future. I know there has been a lot of research on co-housing between sort of the corridor model and the cluster model, which does seem to be more effective in terms of sort of creating smaller, more intimate friendship or relationship groups. Yeah, just sort of thinking about your comment about walking through the communal spaces. At the collective, you had to walk through the lounge, and that became sort of a real social hub. But again, for some people, like they hated that exposure, and like they felt like they had to kind of run through it and get to the elevator so they didn't have to talk to anyone. And it's just like those different levels of safety, feeling safe in space. which is, it's just so interesting. Yeah.
If you don't mind me asking, I mean, how many people were having to walk through the lounge, or were there different lounges for each floor group?
So like the foyer lobby, everyone had to walk through it, so all residents, and then every floor has their own sort of big communal kitchen. But again, some people just completely avoid those, and then it's more kind of like the really extroverted people who loved spending lots of time in there. Yeah.
I have a, sorry, this is Tara, goodness gracious. I have a comment / question, I hope that's okay. When I was at university in the hostel, you know, I would say, so I'm going up to my room to study, which basically is code for please interrupt me with anything. And that worked really well, because really at that age I just wanted to be interrupted, and that was fantastic. What I was going to say is, with this co-living space, I think what's wonderful about it is the concept of triangulation, where you end up, you know, meeting someone who is very different from you, and you know, kind of mushing people in that way is, you know, increases tolerance among people who end up there on someone that you don't usually meet and socialize with, and I think that adds to the richness of living, I suppose, and I think, you know, it can go both ways. And a few years ago, I worked on a project with A Loft, which is a hotel project with Marriott, and they talked about a variety of different ways it could work, and one of it was to introduce a concept of all-female floor for those who, you know, mostly for Asian women who didn't want to be in other floors and share bathrooms or whatever that is. So they had a fantastic data on that. And we've just gotten a ballot for Nightingale. So we would move from a really large apartment to that as a experiment, thanks to my husband. So so I'll report back when we end up there, because I think there's a chance I'll be the person up in the public space doing laundry and end up walking naked back to my apartment. So we'll see what happens. So I'm looking forward to a lot more co-living space in Melbourne for women and about 55 and below, and hope this particular research that you've done would add value to those people who are working those projects. So well done. Yes. So I guess there's no question in there. Sorry, just a mumble.
No, that was great. I was also just thinking you might be interested. There's this housing cooperative in London called OWCH, Older Women's Cohousing Collective. Yeah. And that's sort of like a really great initiative. It's like a whole lot of sort of old women who all got together. And like, we're finally sort of, we can live by ourselves in this lovely group of kind of friends. Yeah, just my...
I think I would totally love that, you know, just get rid of the men, just cook whatever you want. But another point was also, what is the value someone put on the joy of coming somewhere and seeing a friendly face at the entrance versus the nuisance you feel, you know, working in a tight kitchen where there's a spatula everywhere, you know, you just, you know, where do you want to put the importance? So anyway, with that, I'll thank you. Thanks, Jacqueline. Thanks, Anwyn. That was great. Thank you.
Okay. Great.
I think one of the things that strikes me is that just tapping into that, Tava, that idea, what are you willing to run the gauntlet through the lounge room, faced with a whole lot of people you don't want to see, to get to your little room or whatever it might be? that's reflected, I guess, in the turnover or the transience of the population. So you're prepared to put up with something perhaps because you know that that's what the case is when you sign the lease. It's a short-term fix for a lot of people just to fill in while they sort themselves out. They've just moved here, or they've just, you know, they've just been kicked out of their house, or whatever it might be. It's a transient population just dealing with a kind of short-term issue in a lot of cases, I would imagine.
Yeah, true. That there is a need for everyone in different, you know, place where they are, and I think for people who work in the built environment and design community, it's important to address that. So give, you know, have the choice available. So that's great.
All one great. Oops.
Oh, sorry, Peter. Sorry, I was just going to say I was very late to the presentation, but I was very interested in it. It sounded really interesting, Anwyn, and I gather a lot of from your experience in London. But have you seen any? I guess just more on the urban design kind of principles of co-living, like I sort of reflect that myself. I live in a development in Coburg that's it's certainly not a co-living development, but there's a lot of I guess emphasis around the communal space and getting everyone focused on sort of some shared public slash, you know, semi-private space that in an urban design sense sort of beyond the internalized developments itself. Like I think there's a great urban design opportunity there. And did you have a look at that in any of your research?
Well, not specifically, but I suppose sort of things that emerged were like because the bike facility, like bike storage space, sort of became quite a nice little social hub for people who were into that. And the rooftop terrace, I know it's kind of part of the building, but indoor, outdoor, it was very well used. That's like a particularly sort of lovely area that people spend a lot of time socializing in. And maybe some people kind of spoke about how they felt maybe safer because it feels more open than these very enclosed, sort of highly populated areas where you feel like maybe you have to avoid certain people or kind of run away. But yeah, so sorry, I don't have like much to say on that.
No, just just more of a comment really than the opportunities outside the urban design is just as important in these spaces because of those reasons, like you said, that you know there's people need those other spaces to interact and kind of do different things. So sounds awesome.
And when great talk, whenever I hear the words qualitative research, it's music to my ears.
Yes.
And I think I was kind of wondering, a lot of architects around the place at the moment are pretty keen on POE, post-occupancy evaluation. And I think my question to you was, how do you think this sort of qualitative research should be, I mean, it's a bit of a Dorothy Dixer, should be incorporated into those sort of POE systems? And the other question, which is a little bit more general, is with your research, what were you able to theorise out of it?
Okay, so the first part of the question, yes, absolutely. I am a big advocate for qualitative research. I think, like kind of as I was saying before, the whole thing about like, you don't know what questions you should be asking until you kind of expand your horizons a little bit. It's very important to hear those stories. And I think it also, from a designer's perspective, it makes your designs more real, and you're able to relate to people and understand kind of how it's influencing people's lives, which is awesome. So yes, I think qualitative data should be incorporated in POE, absolutely. And in terms of theorizing, Well, my research was very much based sort of in the Heidegger interpretive phenomenological sort of analysis way of thinking. And I suppose my end sort of theory was quite boring in the sense that I think you need lots of spaces for lots of different types of people and habits and identities. So I suppose that was my final theory, that we need to be kind of more inclusive, which is something that people often talk about, by understanding, I say this a lot, the particular, to sort of theorize on the general. And yeah, there's this whole sort of thing about how people, when they're alone, they're lonely. And that's kind of a very, maybe something that's been spoken about a lot. For instance, there was this report that Danny Dorling just brought out, which was that they calculated how lonely Britain was by counting the number of people who were living alone, and kind of just very sort of, straightforward ways of doing things without ever really asking those people, well, actually, are you lonely? So yes, that was a very convoluted way of not answering that question.
No, I get it. That's a good answer. I get it. It's okay. But I think it does point to the need for granular detail when we approach these things, rather than, because even though we might lump particular demographics or groups together, I think by getting that sort of qualitative and granular detail, that we're actually able to get a much deeper understanding. And I think that in this day and age of, mega data science, I think that's really important. So, yeah. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? I'm conscious that it's nearly, well, it's 5 to 1, and many of you may have a 1 o'clock meeting, and it's always good to get yourself sorted for that. So if there are no more questions, I'll wrap things up. Last minute, anybody? Okay. All right. Well, Anwyn, thank you so much for your presentation. It's fascinating. There's a lot in there, and as you say, the particular and the big picture. So plenty to think about. If anybody has any research or any thoughts on the process of research that you'd like to share with this group, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact me or you can contact Jacqueline. So thank you everybody for coming along today, and Jacqueline will be posting a recording of the video onto the YouTube channel. That it's in the chat there, the link. Feel free to share that with anybody that you think might have a particular interest in co-living, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks everyone.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks everyone. That was great.
Thank you.